Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. Today's episode is kind of a special episode. Like I said before, we're still taking a break from the 20th century history, but in the next episode we will be returning to that theme. In this episode, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So when we were wrapping up the Great Leap Forward series, I suddenly came to the realization that we'd actually covered 50 years of Chinese history. If you take the start of the podcast to be 1911 and not the Opium Wars, which we do cover in the first two episodes, but let's pretend that doesn't happen. Let's pretend that we started in 1911. So we've actually fully covered the years 1911 to 1961. So I thought something fun that we could do to review those 50 years would be to have a little bit of a quiz. Now, this is not meant to be taken seriously in any way, unless you're using this as sort of a teaching resource, in which case, feel free to do that. You can go ahead and do that. And I will also link in the description of this episode to the questions and answers, which I'll post on my website. But this is just a 40-question multiple choice quiz that you can play at home at your leisure. You can use a pen and paper, or you can just do it in your head if you want. Feel free to do this alongside whatever it is that you're doing, washing dishes, playing a video game. I don't know what you do when you listen to this podcast, but yeah, that's the theme of today's episode. So what I'll do is I'll do 10 questions at a time. It's kind of divided into sections, but also not completely evenly, so don't worry about trying to remember specific themes or anything like that. Each question has 3 potential answers. So let's get started. So, question number 1. In what year did the Xinhai Revolution, the revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, take place? A. 1909, B. 1910, or C. 1911? Again, in what year did the Xinhai Revolution take place? 1909, 1910, or 1911? Question 2. Who was the leader of the Nationalist Party, often referred to as the father of the Chinese Revolution? Was it A. Chiang Kai-shek, B. Sun Yat-sen, or C. Mao Zedong? Who was the leader of the Nationalist Party? A. Chiang Kai-shek, B. Sun Yat-sen, or C. Mao Zedong? Question 3. What was the name of the general and politician who tried to restore the Qing dynasty and then instated himself as emperor briefly before passing away in 1916? Was it A. Yuan Shikai, B. Song Jiaoren, or C. Feng Yuxiang? What was the name of the general and politician who tried to restore the Qing dynasty and then installed himself as emperor briefly before dying in 1916? Yuan Shikai, Song Jiaoren, or Feng Yuxiang? Question 4. In 1916, as part of the New Culture movement, writer Hu Shi introduced his 8 principles for writing new literature in the vernacular. Which of these was not one of those principles? A. Do not use literary allusions. B. Write about emotions even if you don't feel those emotions yourself. C. Do not imitate the writings of ancients. Which of these is not one of Hu Shi's 8 principles? A. Do not use literary allusions. B. Write about emotions, even if you don't feel those emotions yourself. C. Do not imitate the writings of ancients. Question 5. The May 4th movement was a major cultural movement that was formative in China's modernization. In what year did it begin? A. 1917, B. 1919, or C. 1921? In what year did the May 4th movement begin? 1917, 1919, or 1921? Question 6. The Chinese Communist Party was formed on a summer's day in 1921. How many delegates attended the founding? A. 18, B. 80, or C. 180? How many Chinese Communist Party delegates attended the party's founding in 1921? A. 18, B. 80, or C. 180? Question 7. The Song sisters were 3 well-educated women from a rich and prominent Chinese family who all married famous husbands. One married the richest man in China, one married Sun Yat-sen. What was the name of the sister who married Chiang Kai-shek? A. Song Ailing, B. Song Meiling, or C. Song Qingling? Which of the 3 Song sisters married Chiang Kai-shek? Ailing, Meiling, or Qingling? Question 8. In what year did the Nationalist Party launch their northern expedition to reunite China? A. 1924, B. 1925, or C. 1926? In what year did the Nationalist Party launch their northern expedition to reunite China? A. 1924, B. 1925, or C. 1926? Question 9. After making a lot of progress in the northern expedition, a rift appears in the nationalist ranks. Chiang Kai-shek bases himself in Shanghai. Where is his rival Wang Jingwei based? A. Beijing, B. Wuhan, or C. Nanjing? After a fight between 2 leaders in the nationalist camp, Chiang Kai-shek bases himself as the leader in Shanghai. Where does his rival Wang Jingwei base himself? Beijing, Wuhan, or Nanjing? And question 10. On April 12, 1927, the Nationalist Party turned on their communist comrades, killing many party and union leaders and expelling the communists from major cities. What was the name of this incident? A. The Shanghai Massacre, B. The Green Gang Incident, or C. The Nanking Massacre? What was the name of the event that saw the Nationalist Party turn on the communists, expel them from cities, and execute many of their leaders? The Shanghai Massacre, the Green Gang Incident, or the Nanking Massacre? Okay, so those were the first 10 questions. Fairly painless, I'd like to think, at least. Might not be very fresh in your memory if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time. But let's go through them. So the first question was, I hope, quite straightforward. In what year does the Xinhai Revolution start? I did say it at the beginning of the podcast. The answer was C, 1911. The leader of the Nationalist Party, who was referred to as the father of the revolution, was Sun Yat-sen, of course. So that was B. The name of the general who tried to restore the Qing dynasty and then made himself emperor and then also died in 1916 was Yuan Shikai. So that was A, Yuan Shikai. Hu Shi's 8 principles for writing new literature in the vernacular. Which of these wasn't one of those principles? So the answer was B, writing about emotions even if you don't feel those emotions yourself. The correct principle is actually do not write about emotions even if you don't feel those emotions yourself. I think that one kind of gave itself away because most of his principles are do not principles. So do not use idioms, do not use old language, do not imitate the ancients, etc. Question 5, another date question. When did the May 4th movement begin? That was 1919. So that was B. Question 6. How many delegates attended the founding of the Chinese Communist Party? It was A, 18. 180 would have probably been every single member of the Communist Party at that time. Question 7 about the Song sisters. Which one was married to Chiang Kai-shek? The answer was B, Meiling. So the other sisters, Ailing was married to H.H. Kung, who was the richest man in China. Sun Yat-sen had tried to woo her but failed and ended up marrying her younger sister, Qingling. Question 8 was, in what year did the Nationalist Party launch the Northern Expedition? That was in 1926, so the answer was C. It's also the same year that Sun Yat-sen passed away. Question 9. When there is a split in the nationalist ranks, Chiang Kai-shek bases himself in Shanghai, Wang Jingwei bases himself in Wuhan. So the answer was B, Wuhan. And then later on, the government is established in Nanjing, but that's not until a little bit later on. And finally, question 10. What was the name of the incident where the nationalists turned on the communists, killing many of their members and leaders? The answer was A, the Shanghai Massacre. The Green Gang were the sort of Shanghai underground mafia, I suppose you could say. They actually helped in carrying out the incident, but it wasn't named after them. The Nanjing Massacre is, of course, the name of the incident where the Japanese invaded and caused much destruction during the Second World War, at the beginning of the Second World War in 1937. Okay, part 2 of the quiz. We're moving on to the late 1920s, sort of early mid-1930s. Okay, so question 11. What was the major ideological difference between Mao Zedong and other leaders in the Communist Party? A. Mao wanted to retaliate against the nationalists immediately instead of waiting to recuperate. B. Mao believed that the peasants would be the backbone of the revolution and not urban workers. Or C. Mao wanted to seek more help from the Soviet Union, whereas other leaders wanted to be more independent. So, which of these is the main difference between Mao and the other leaders of the communists? Mao wanted to retaliate against the nationalists immediately. Mao believed that the peasants were the backbone of the revolution. Or C. Mao wanted to seek more help from the Soviet Union. Question 12. Following their purge from the cities, the communists set up a series of Soviets in the countryside. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to destroy the biggest Soviet in Jiangxi, and led a number of encirclement campaigns to drive them out between 1931 and 1935. How many encirclement campaigns did it take for him to win? A. 3, B. 4, or C. 5? How many encirclement campaigns did it take for Chiang Kai-shek to drive the communists out of Jiangxi? Was it 3, 4, or 5? Question 13. Having been driven out of their last stronghold, the communists began their long march to the north to resettle in the mountains. Roughly what percentage of the Communist Party members made it to the end? A. 10%, B. 30%, or C. 50%? Roughly what percentage of Communist Party members survived the Long March? A. 10%, B. 30%, or C. 50%? Question 14. Following the Long March, Mao became the leader of the party, and Mao Zedong thought became the leading ideology of the party that all members had to study. Which of these is not a feature of Mao Zedong thought? A. The party should focus its efforts on developing the revolution in the countryside. B. Men and women are equals. And C. The party should adopt a pacifist approach to revolution. Which of these is not a feature of Mao Zedong thought? The party should focus on developing the revolution in the countryside, men and women should be seen as equals, or the party should adopt a pacifist approach to the revolution. Question 15. The communists' new base in Yan'an attracted many intellectuals from the cities who were fleeing the nationalist purge of the left, or who were just full of youthful, hopeful, revolutionary spirit. What was the name of the university they established to support their study of communism and leftist art? Was it A. Sun Yat-sen University, B. the Luxun Academy, or C. the Institute of Mao Zedong? What was the name of the university established by left-wing intellectuals in Yan'an? A. Sun Yat-sen University, B. Luxun Academy, C. Institute of Mao Zedong. Question 16. In 1942, the first ever rectification movement was launched in Yan'an. One of the victims was a young writer named Wang Shiwei, who wrote a piece entitled Wild Lily. What was the main problem that he highlighted in this essay? A. The abusive nature of higher-ranking cadres and the deprivation of lower-ranking members. B. The squalid conditions in Yan'an and being forced to integrate with the peasants. Or C. Lack of intellectual freedom and expression of thought. What was the main argument of Wang Shiwei's essay Wild Lily? A. The abusive nature of higher-ranking cadres and the deprivation of lower-ranking cadres. B. The squalid conditions in Yan'an and being forced to integrate with peasants. Or C. The lack of intellectual freedom. Question 17. While the communists were stashed away in the mountains, Chiang Kai-shek had established a nationalist regime in Nanjing. They made a number of economic reforms, including minting a new currency. What was the name of this currency? Was it A. the Chinese dollar, B. the renminbi, or C. the yuan? What was the name of the new currency established by Chiang Kai-shek? The Chinese dollar, the renminbi, or the yuan? Question 18. A fledgling feminist movement took off during the Republican period and into the Nanjing decade. However, many intellectuals had a problem with certain aspects of the modern woman. Which of these was their biggest problem with the movement? A. Women working outside the home. B. Women who obsessed over modern consumerism and Western aesthetics. Or C. Women who went to university and talked about politics in public. What was the main problem the traditional intellectuals had with the feminist movement during the Nanjing decade? Women working outside the home, women obsessing over consumerism and Westernism, or women who went to university and talked about politics? Question 19. During the Nanjing decade, intellectual writers tried their best to popularize a serious form of literature. But another kind of literature was more popular among the urban masses, a genre that focused on escapism, errant knight stories, and modern romances. What was the genre of literature called? A. Dragon and Phoenix literature, B. Moon and Stars literature, or C. Mandarin duck and butterfly literature? What was the name of the genre of literature that was popular among the urban working masses that focused on romance stories and heroes' journeys? Dragon and Phoenix literature, Moon and Stars literature, Mandarin duck and butterfly literature. And question 20. During the Nanjing decade, a certain group of artists were targeted for their left-leaning art style and communist sympathies. What form of art did they participate in? A. Chinese ink painting, B. Woodblock printing, or C. Comic book drawing? What was the main form of art popular with communist sympathizing left-leaning artists? Was it A. Chinese ink painting, B. Woodblock printing, or C. Comic book drawing? Okay, let's go back through 11 through 20. So question 11 was, what was the major ideological difference between Mao Zedong and other leaders? The answer was B, that Mao believed that the peasants should be the backbone of the revolution. Many of the other leaders still believed that they should be focusing on urban workers, but Mao kind of knew before everyone else that the moment had passed, especially following the Shanghai massacre. Question 12, how many encirclement campaigns did it take for Chiang Kai-shek to get rid of the communists? The answer was 5. So C, 5. Question 13, how many communists made it to the end of the Long March? The answer was A, 10%. Question 14, after the Long March, Mao Zedong became leader and Mao Zedong thought was established. Which of these was not a feature of Mao Zedong thought? The answer was C, that the party should adopt a pacifist approach to revolution. Mao Zedong very famously said, "A revolution is not a tea party." Question 15. What was the name of the university that was established in Yan'an? The answer was B, the Luxun Academy. Sun Yat-sen University does exist. I think there are multiple ones, actually. I think there's one in mainland China, one in Taiwan, and there may also be one in Russia as well. Question 16. Wang Shiwei's essay, Wild Lily, was mainly about what problem that was emerging in Yan'an? The answer was A, the abusive nature of higher-ranking cadres and the deprivation of lower-ranking cadres. Question 17. What was the name of the new currency that was established by Chiang Kai-shek? The answer was the yuan, or yuan, depending on how good your pronunciation is. Mine is really bad today for some reason. Both the yuan and the renminbi are used interchangeably today to refer to Chinese currency. Question 18. What was the problem that many intellectuals saw with the modern feminist movement during the Nanjing decade? The answer was B. They were worried that women were obsessing too much over consumerism and Western aesthetics, basically to try and make themselves look good, to find a good husband. They weren't actually interested in advancing women's rights. Question 19. What was the name of the popular form of literature that focused on romance stories and errant knight tales? The answer was C, Mandarin duck and butterfly literature. And finally, what was the main type of art that many left-wing artists participated in that got them into trouble during the Nanjing decade? The answer was B, woodblock printing. Okay, questions 21 to 30. This is covering quite a long period of time, so from around the start of the Sino-Japanese War to the founding of the PRC. So, question 21. Until a few years ago, the agreed upon date for the Japanese invasion of China was 1937, when the Marco Polo Bridge incident took place. However, the Chinese government recently revised this date. What is the new date that they've changed it to? Is it A, 1931, B, 1933, or C, 1935? What is the new date that the Chinese government has assigned to the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War? Is it A, 1931, B, 1933, or C, 1935? Question 22. After the Japanese took over the capital of Nanjing, which city did the nationalists retreat to for their wartime base? Was it A, Wuhan, B, Chongqing, or C, Xi'an? Which city became the nationalist base after they were driven out of their capital in Nanjing by the Japanese? Was it A, Wuhan, B, Chongqing, or C, Xi'an? Question 23. The nationalists were heavily supported by the US military during the Second World War. Which US general famously did not get on well with Chiang Kai-shek and had to be replaced? Was it A, General Joseph Stilwell, B, General George Marshall, or C, General Albert Wedemeyer? Which US general got on so badly with Chiang Kai-shek that he had to be quickly replaced during the course of the Sino-Japanese War? Joseph Stilwell, George Marshall, or Albert Wedemeyer? Which of these was the biggest problem that the nationalists faced with their post-war governance? A, lack of democracy. B, disparity between rural and urban living standards. C, hyperinflation. What was the major problem with post-war nationalist governance? Lack of democracy, disparity between rural and urban living standards, or hyperinflation? Question 25. What is the official date of the founding of the PRC? A, 10th of September 1949, B, 1st of October 1949, or C, 5th of November 1949? What is the official date of the founding of the PRC? 10th of September, 1st of October, or 5th of November 1949? Question 26. The Chinese national anthem was adopted from the theme of a popular patriotic film entitled Children of Troubled Times. What is the name of the Chinese national anthem? A, The East is Red, B, March of the Volunteers, C, The Three Principles of the People. What is the name of the Chinese national anthem? The East is Red, March of the Volunteers, or The Three Principles of the People? Question 27. The famous painting The Founding of the Nation by Dong Shiwen was altered multiple times to take out and add back in controversial members of the party who fell out of favour with Mao. How many times was it altered in total? A, twice, B, 3 times, or C, 4 times? How many times was the painting, The Founding of the Nation, depicting the leaders at the founding of the PRC in Beijing, altered? A, twice, B, 3 times, or C, 4 times? Question 28. Who was the first premier of the PRC until his death in 1976? A, Liu Shaoqi, B, Zhou Enlai, or C, Lin Biao? Who was the first premier of the PRC until his death in 1976? Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, or Lin Biao? Question 29. As part of their changes to Chinese society, the CCP introduced a marriage law that allowed people to marry whomever they chose, to get divorced, and to change the legal marriage age to prevent child marriage. In what year was this law introduced? A, 1949, B. 1950, or C. 1952? In what year was the marriage law introduced? 1949, 1950, or 1952? And question 30. The Five Antis campaign aimed to reduce waste and stimulate the post-war Chinese economy by getting the business community to eliminate bribery, tax evasion, fraud, theft of state assets, and what? A. Leakage of state economic secrets, B. Extortionate rents, or C. International trade. The Five Antis campaign sought the elimination of bribery, tax evasion, fraud, theft, and which of the following? The leakage of state economic secrets, extortionate rents, or international trade. Okay, let's run through them. So question 21 was, what year has the Chinese government changed the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War to? The answer is 1931. This is to indicate that the Japanese takeover of Manchuria was really the beginning of their aggression and therefore the beginning of the war. Question 22. Where did the nationalists retreat to for their wartime base during the Sino-Japanese War? The answer was B. Chongqing. Question 23. Which US general did not get on well with Chiang Kai-shek and ended up having to be replaced? The answer was A. Joseph Stilwell. Question 24. What was the biggest problem with the post-war nationalist government? The answer was C. Hyperinflation. A, which was lack of democracy, and B, disparity between rural and urban living standards actually existed before the war. So hyperinflation was new. Question 25. What is the official date of the founding of the PRC? The answer is B, 1st of October 1949. Question 26. What is the name of the Chinese national anthem? The answer is B, March of the Volunteers. Question 27. The famous painting, The Founding of the Nation by Dong Xiwen, was altered how many times? The answer was A, it was altered twice. So it was painted, then it was altered, and then later, when Dong Xiwen was too old to alter it himself, his students had to make the changes for him. Question 28. Who was the first premier of the PRC? The answer was B, Zhou Enlai. Liu Shaoqi was vice chairman of the CCP, and Lin Biao was at different times in charge of the PLA military. Question 29. When was the marriage law introduced? The answer was B, 1950. And question 30. The Five Antis campaign aimed to reduce bribery, tax evasion, fraud, theft of state assets, and A, leakage of state economic secrets, which apparently was a huge problem at the time. Who would have known? Okay, we're down to the final questions. Hopefully these ones will be easier if you've been struggling so far, because they are obviously about the most recent set of episodes. But if you've binged to this point, then you should be doing equally well throughout. I will be checking your answers after the test is over to see who got the highest marks. Okay, let's go for it. Question 31. When the CCP introduced their land reform campaign to redistribute land in the countryside, they divided the peasantry into 5 different categories. Which of these was not one of those categories? A, landlord, B, rich peasant, or C, merchant? Which of these is not one of the 5 categories that the CCP used to divide people up into in the countryside? What a strange sentence that was. So A, landlord, B, rich peasant, or C, merchant. Question 32. In 1950, China entered into the Korean War once the US Army crossed the 38th parallel. What is the Korean War known as in China? A, the war to defend the Korean people. B, the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea. C, the war to liberate Korea and defeat the imperialists. What is the name for the Korean War in China? A, the war to defend the Korean people. B, the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea. C, the war to liberate Korea and defeat the imperialists. Question 33. The 5-year plan system was adopted by the Chinese in the early 1950s and has been continually used by the Chinese government to plan the development of the economy ever since. The 14th 5-year plan was announced earlier this year. What were the dates of the first 5-year plan? Is it A, 1953 to 1957, B, 1954 to 1958, or C, 1955 to 1960? What were the dates of China's first 5-year plan? 1953 to 57, 1954 to 58, or 1955 to 60? Question 34. In the mid-1950s, many intellectuals and writers rallied against bureaucratism and lack of intellectual freedom in the literary world. One writer famously irritated the party with his demands for variety and freedom of expression, so much so that the party launched a very specific campaign against him and his followers. What was this writer's name? Was it A, Ai Qing, B, Lu Xun, or C, Hu Feng? Which writer had his very own campaign launched against him in the mid-1950s for demanding too much variety and freedom of expression in literature? Ai Qing, Lu Xun, or Hu Feng? Question 35. The 100 Flowers campaign was launched in 1956 as a call to let the freedom of expression and thought develop in the fields of literature, academia, and science. What was the full name of the campaign? A. Let the 100 flowers bloom, let the intellectuals go down to the masses. B. Let the 100 flowers bloom, let the 100 schools of thought contend. C. Let the 100 flowers bloom, let the ink flow. What was the full name of the 100 Flowers campaign? Let the 100 flowers bloom, let the intellectuals go down to the masses. Let the 100 flowers bloom, let the 100 schools of thought contend. Or let the 100 flowers bloom, let the ink flow. Question 36. The anti-rightist campaign was launched soon after the 100 Flowers movement as a backlash against the criticisms aimed at the party. The campaign targeted not only writers, but intellectuals and academics in a range of fields. One of these academics was a man named Fei Xiaotong. What was he best known for? A. Pioneering sociology, B. Pioneering psychology, or C. Pioneering geography. One of the victims of the anti-rightist campaign was a man named Fei Xiaotong, who was a pioneer in which of the following fields in China? Sociology, psychology, or geography? Question 36. Which famous writer, who had been well known within the party since the Yan'an days, was purged as a result of the anti-rightist movement? A. Wu Xun, B. Yu Pingbo, or C. Dingling? Which famous writer, who had been well known since the Yan'an days, was purged as a result of the anti-rightist movement? Wu Xun, Yu Pingbo, or Dingling? Question 38. The Great Leap Forward was China's grand plan to distance itself from Soviet-style planning and become a self-sufficient nation by competing with developed countries and their production quotas in various industries. Which country were they primarily trying to overtake, and in which industry? A. The US in coal production, B. The UK in steel production, or C. The USSR in grain production? The Great Leap Forward was China's attempt to overtake which country in which industry? The US in coal production, the UK in steel production, or the USSR in grain production? Question 39. In June 1959, the Communist Party held a conference in Lushan to discuss the excesses of the leap and devise a new strategy. What was the name of the man who wrote a letter to Mao criticizing the leap and pointing out the starvation in the countryside? A. Lin Biao, B. Liu Shaoqi, or C. Peng Dehuai? What was the name of the man, possibly the only man, to call out Mao during the Lushan conference and openly discuss the beginning of mass starvation during the Great Leap Forward? Lin Biao, Liu Shaoqi, or Peng Dehuai? And finally, question 40. Which of these is the most widely accepted number of excess deaths that occurred as a result of the Great Leap Famine? A. 30 million, B. 40 million, or C. 50 million? Which of these is the most widely accepted number of excess deaths as a result of the Great Leap Famine? Is it 30 million, 40 million, or 50 million? Okay, that was all of the questions. So let's just go through the answers for the last section. Question 31, which of these was not a category? The answer was C, merchants. So the 5 categories were landlord, rich peasant, middle peasant, poor peasant, and landless, or just like a labourer who owned no land at all. Question 32. What is the name of the Korean War in China? The answer was B, the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea. Question 33. What were the dates of the first 5-year plan? The answer was A, 1953 to 1957. Question 34. What was the name of the writer who had his very own purge campaign launched against him and his friends? The answer was C, Hu Feng. Question 35. What is the full name of the 100 Flowers campaign? The answer was B, Let the 100 Flowers Bloom, let the 100 Schools of Thought contend. This is actually a callback to a phrase that I think originated in the Warring States period, talking about all the different philosophical schools that were coming out during that period. So yeah, Mao had sort of repurposed that for his own use. Question 36. Fei Xiaotong was a pioneer in which field? The answer was A, sociology. He was a very famous sociologist in China, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, and his studies on peasant ways of life and the history of peasants and things like that were heavily sort of condemned by the CCP and particularly Mao for being too scientific and kind of focusing too much on economic things and not focusing enough on class struggle. So Fei Xiaotong had to renounce his ideas. He was also further denigrated during the Cultural Revolution, but his work and his fame were reinstated after that period. Question 37. Which famous writer who had been well known since the Yan'an days was purged as a result of the anti-rightist movement? The answer was C, Ding Ling. Question 38. The Great Leap Forward was an attempt to overtake which country in which industry? The answer was B, the UK, in steel production. Question 39. What was the name of the man who bravely stood up to Mao Zedong, criticizing the Great Leap Forward and pointing out the excess deaths in the countryside? The answer was Peng Dehuai. And finally, question 40. What is the most widely accepted number of deaths as a result of the Great Leap Famine? The answer was A, 30 million. So that was it for this episode. If you want to see the answers, use them for your own purposes, like as a teaching resource, I will be listing them on the Sinobabble website. If I remember, I will put a link in this episode as well, but if not, just go to the website and you'll be able to find them there. Or if you just want to double check your answers or fight with me about any of them, then feel free to do so. I thought that would just be a fun way to recap everything that we've covered so far. 50 years is actually a long period of time. We've done almost 40 episodes. So well done everyone for persevering and for probably forgetting the majority of names and dates. I will not lie, when I was writing these questions, I had to look up some of the dates and names as well. So you are not alone. Before I wrap up this episode, just a few announcements. So like I said at the beginning, the next episode will be going back to talking about Chinese history. We're going to be talking about the Sino-Soviet split. It's taking me a while to put together because it's very complicated. I may need to divide it into 2 episodes. I haven't decided yet, but yeah, look forward to that if you've been missing your Chinese history fix. Don't forget that you can also sign up for the Sinobabble newsletter, where I post once a week about the podcast, and then on alternate weeks, I will post sort of like a long form newsletter looking at a piece of current affairs or news in China and analysing that in terms of China's culture or history. I think it's pretty good. The latest one was about how recent military exercises by China over Taiwan may not mean what everyone thinks it means, and how China is approaching the question of Taiwanese reintegration into the PRC. Also, if you want to, you can donate to the podcast by going to the Sinobabble website and clicking on the donate button. You can make a one-off donation or set up like a monthly thing to donate continuously forever. And my final announcement is just sort of something to let you guys know. I'm actually currently 6 months pregnant, which isn't relevant in and of itself, but this is just to let you know that in a few months' time, with the arrival of the newborn, it will be improbable, if not impossible, for me to keep updating the podcast. The baby is due in July, so if I suddenly drop off the face of the world in July for a few months, you will know the reason why. I'm just letting you know now, because obviously from this point onwards anything could happen. So if I suddenly disappear, I haven't been kidnapped by the CCP, I've just had a child. I'm trying to do as many episodes in advance as I possibly can. It's quite difficult, as you know, this is quite a research intensive, heavily scripted podcast, so it's quite difficult to get even one episode ahead. But I will try my best so that you are not bereft of content for like 6 months or anything like that. I promise. Okay, that's everything that I have to say. Those are all of my updates and announcements. Thanks so much for listening, guys, and I hope you tune in next time.